Okay, so this will be part 2 of the reproductive lecture series. And again, we're going to be covering the female reproductive anatomy and the female reproductive physiology in this section. So please remember that I did post an updated lecture for this. There are a couple of extra slides that I have added into especially the female reproductive system here that I think you'll find to be very helpful. Instead of me just talking, I usually just talk through those slides, but because this is an online class, I actually added in the slides with the verbiage on there. So make sure that you look on the modules and you'll see that I've posted that updated version for you here. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with the female reproductive system. And real quick, I'm just going to, like always, choose my pen color here. Okay, so when we talk about, again, the female reproductive system, we can, of course, start by talking about the organs of the female reproductive system and their function. And so the main function of the female reproductive organs are going to be to produce, obviously, and maintain the egg cells, right? The gametes. Also, to transport these cells to the site of fertilization. Okay, so we'll talk about again how they're released from the ovaries and make their way into the uterine tubes, which will be the site of fertilization. Also, female reproductive anatomy, again, is going to provide a favorable environment for the developing fetus. So again, not only is it the site for fertilization, but obviously, again, then it's the site for the developing fetus as well. And that will be in the uterus. We'll talk about that. And then finally, obviously, the female reproductive anatomy has to be able to go through that lovely process of labor to give birth and then to produce the female sex hormones. Okay, so probably all intuitive things that you already know, but again, I have it there just in case. So let's talk now about the female reproductive anatomy. So again, hopefully this will help you not just for lecture, but also for the lab section as we go through the actual reproductive anatomy in this slide here. So again, if you look here, excuse me, here are the ovaries. So again, and they're just, they've done a mid-sagittal section, so you're obviously just seeing the one ovary on the right side there. But so here would be the ovary, and then here you're going to see these little finger-like structures that we call fimbriae, and they're coming off of the uterine tube here. So the uterine tube and the ovaries don't actually directly connect. And so when the egg is released, these little fimbriae, these little finger-like structures will move and create a current that will pull the egg into the uterine tube. So here's the uterine tube. Uterine tube, also called the fallopian tube, same thing. Excuse me there. Then you can see here, obviously, you know, if it's carrying an egg, it will carry that egg into the uterus. And this is the uterus here. And if an egg were to be fertilized in the uterine tube, then the egg, once it hits the uterus, would implant in the uterus. So here's the uterus. And then at the very, oops, sorry about that. Kicked me out there. There we go. So here at the very base of the uterus here is going to be the cervix. Okay, so basically the cervix is the opening into the uterus here. And then just below the cervix here would be the vagina. And, and here, obviously right in front of the uterus is going to be the urinary bladder. So you can see why, again, as you know, if a female became pregnant, then as the uterus enlarges, you can see how it would put pressure right on the urinary bladder just below it there. So there's the urinary bladder. Here's the urethra. And let's see, here is the symphysis pubis. So again, that if you remember way back when we did the skeletal anatomy, in the very beginning of the semester. We talked about the symphysis pubis being a joint here, where again there's a bit of cartilage in between, and that's important, especially for giving going through labor and childbirth, because that symphysis pubis has a little bit of give because there's just some cartilage there. And again, that allows a little bit of stretching as a female goes through labor. And let's see, we'll go over some other anatomy. They're drawing in here the erectile tissue, the clitoris, and then you have it's not drawn very well here. I have a better picture of this, of the labia minora and the labia majora, and then of course the vaginal orifice there. And then this is just showing you again, just for orientation, the rectum and the anus. So that goes over some of your basic reproductive female anatomy. So the primary sex organs, of course, or the primary sex, gonads for the females are going to be the ovaries. The ovaries are going to be the site of egg production. And the other parts of the system are going to consist of some of the external and internal accessory organs. But again, the primary sex organ is obviously the ovaries. Remember, the primary sex organ or gonads in the male were the testes. So here it's the ovaries. So let's talk about what happens in the ovaries. The ovaries are going to be these solid kind of oval-shaped structures that are located within the lateral pelvic cavity. So again, in the pelvic cavity, off to either side. And when we look at the structure of the ovaries are going to be subdivided into the medulla, and I'm going to show you a picture of this in just a minute. The medulla towards the inside, and then the outer cortex. And the medulla will be where we'll have blood vessels and nerves and things like that. And the cortex, the outer cortex, is actually going to be where we're going to house the eggs. The medulla, I have it here, sorry. The medulla is made up, again, of some connective tissue, your blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves. So again, that's all going to be in the central medulla. And then the outer cortex is what's going to contain the egg. So basically, and you're going to see we're going to call these follicles, because there's going to be some tissue that surrounds the egg that makes up what we call the egg follicle. So technically, we call those eggs follicles. And the cortex is going to contain all the follicles and is covered by a layer of cuboidal epithelium. You don't have to necessarily know that it's cuboidal epithelium, but since you may remember a little bit about your tissues from the beginning, at least tells you what type of tissue it is. So here again, you can see here's going to be where all your blood vessels and your lymphatics and connective tissue are going to be housed, and this is the medulla. So this is the medulla. And here, it's in the cortex out here where we're going to house all of the follicles. And we're going to talk about this kind of a cool diagram, because it actually shows you the different stages of development of these developing follicles as they get ready for ovulation. So we'll actually talk about how this happens and how we go from the primordial follicles to primary follicles to eventually a secondary follicle, and then to what's called a mature follicle. So this one would be a mature follicle with an antrum, and we'll talk about that. And then eventually, again, when the actual oocyte is released, this would be ovulation. And again, remember, this would be released into there'd be those little finger-like structures, okay, surrounding the ovary here, and they would create a current to draw that oocyte into the uterine tubes. And then we'll talk about when ovulation occurs, there is some tissue left behind here, some cells left behind from the follicle, and how those develop into what's called the corpus luteum, and what we'll talk about the role that the corpus luteum has in the ovarian and uterine cycle as well. So that's all to come. Okay, so let's talk about some of these follicles. So again, the very first stage for the follicle development is going to be the primordial follicles, and these are what are formed during prenatal development. So again, these are going to be formed before birth. And they're just going to be a bunch of group of cells that form these primordial follicles. And each of them are going to basically consist of a primary oocyte that's going to contain the genetic information, surrounded by these follicular cells. Okay. So if you look, these are all these primordial follicles. So it's true that, again, we're born with all of our precursors for our eggs. So very different, right, than your male reproductive anatomy. Men will make sperm throughout their life. So they're constantly making sperm and then releasing them, making more sperm, releasing them, where females are born with all of our eggs, okay, in the form of these primordial follicles. And so again, very, very different in terms of when you're doing your comparison between male and female. Early in development, the primary oocytes, okay, and so inside here, if you look in these like primordial follicles, in these primordial follicles here, again, the central area here is going to be the actual oocyte that contains the DNA, and then these cells towards the outside, the darker pink cells, will be the follicle cells. And so early in development, the primary oocytes start to undergo meiosis, okay? But they halt the process in the middle of meiosis, meaning they don't complete meiosis. They just start the process of meiosis, and then it halts right smack dab in the middle of meiosis. And it will not resume until puberty, okay? And really, it won't resume until ultimately, and this is a little more information than you have to know, but ultimately, we won't complete meiosis until fertilization, which is kind of interesting. Only 400,000 oocytes actually remain at puberty, and only 400 to 500 will actually be released from the ovaries during the reproductive life of a female. So kind of interesting in terms of how many eggs you have and how many eggs are really not used. So the majority of your eggs are not used. So this is kind of cool. This actually talks a little bit about oogenesis, this slide here. And so unlike a spermatocyte, oogenesis is going to happen very differently in that we're still going to be undergoing the same process of meiosis to half the genetic material, right? We need to half the genetic material just like we did in the production of sperm cells so that sperm and egg can meet, make a whole individual. But the difference here is that as we go through these two sets of meiotic divisions, you're going to see that instead of ending up with 4 cells, we're going to end up with 1 cell. Okay, so what's going to happen is we're going to have our primary oocyte, and as it goes through its first meiotic division, it's going to produce our secondary oocyte here, and then this thing called a polar body. Okay, and so what's crazy about this is that when this division happens, this meiotic division happens, the cytoplasm is not going to be divided up equally. So the majority of the cytoplasm and all the organelles are going to go into 1 cell, and the other cell is going to be much, much smaller, and it basically is just going to contain the DNA, just going to contain some DNA. And so the reason that this occurs is that when we're producing this oocyte to be fertilized, we want to produce an oocyte with lots of cytoplasm and lots of organelles, because once it's fertilized, it's going to need that cytoplasm and those organelles to undergo the first couple sets of divisions. So that's why it comes equipped to do that. And so this is the reason that we produce these polar bodies. We're basically producing these polar bodies so that we can put all of the resources into these extra resources into this 1 cell, okay, to prepare it for fertilization. And as you can see here, then the oocyte doesn't actually complete the second meiotic division, which is kind of interesting, until fertilization takes place. So this actually happens after fertilization takes place. And so when fertilization takes place, again, when sperm hits the egg will very quickly go through that second meiotic division. And when it does, it will release, again, the extra genetic material in the form of another polar body. So instead of producing 4 eggs, it will produce 1 egg and a bunch of these polar bodies. And so you may say, well, what happens to these polar bodies? Why do we have these polar bodies? And so the main reason that we have these polar bodies is basically to kind of ensure that we get rid of this kind of excess DNA. And then we can put all of our resources, again, all of the organelles, all of the cytoplasm into this 1 egg cell so that we can undergo these initial mitotic divisions that we're going to need to do when right after the egg is fertilized. So again, the polar body's main role in reproduction is really to allow for the production of an egg cell that has these massive amounts of cytoplasm and all these bunches of organelles that are going to be required, again, to carry out what we call the zygote through the first few cell divisions. And that zygote, again, is a fertilized egg. But at the same time, we need to produce these polar bodies so that we can also get rid of some of that excess DNA. Because otherwise, if all the DNA stayed here in this cell, we would have way too much DNA, and fertilization wouldn't be able to take place. So again, unlike a spermatocyte, when that primary oocyte divides, the cytoplasm is going to be divvied up unequally. So again, this is my next slide. We kind of already talked about this, what the function of polar bodies are. Again, the main function of those polar bodies is to allow for, again, an egg cell, the production of an egg cell that has lots of cytoplasm, lots of organelles. So that way then, if that egg is fertilized, that zygote is ready to go through the first few cell divisions, and it's equipped to do so. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about how the follicles mature for these eggs. So at puberty, and this is where we start to get into talking about some of the hormones. At puberty, follicle-stimulating hormone will be released, and it's going to initiate the follicle maturation process. So, and again, when we talk about the follicle maturation, what we mean is initially you start out with these little primordial follicles where you just have a few follicle cells that are surrounding the oocyte. And what ends up happening is once again puberty hits and follicle stimulating hormones released, then that follicle stimulating hormone will cause the follicle to undergo basically cell division of these follicular cells, so that they produce a bunch of these follicular cells around the initial oocyte. So that way then the follicle is going to enlarge. Again, the follicular cells are going to proliferate. So that's what we mean when we say that the cells are going to be undergoing cell division to produce, again, a larger follicle now. And this big fluid-filled cavity right here is going to form. And this fluid-filled cavity is eventually going to be called the antrum. Okay? And that fluid-filled cavity will be important for kind of pushing the oocyte to one side of the follicle, which is eventually going to be important for ovulation. So a mature follicle, again, their secondary follicle here is going to be when we start to fill in that we'll start to produce that fluid-filled cavity. Now, in a mature follicle, we've got this really large fluid-filled cavity that now we call the antrum. Okay, so again, here this fluid-filled cavity eventually becomes the antrum in the mature follicle, and the secondary oocyte, which is going to be here, and that means if it's a secondary oocyte, then the oocyte has gone through meiosis 1, so it's gone through the first meiotic division. And that secondary oocyte is going to be surrounded by this layer called the zona pellucida. And that's going to be this, let me go back here. So that's going to be this clear blue layer right around the oocyte. And then the zona pellucida will be attached to what's called the corona radiata. And the corona radiata is going to be, again, these follicular cells that are right around the zona pellucida right here that are surrounding the oocyte. So this enlarging fluid-filled cavity here will press on the oocyte and press it to one side. And that's going to be important because as it presses it to this one side, it causes this oocyte to kind of blister out, push out and blister out of the follicle in preparation for ovulation. So eventually it'll be released from the follicle. Okay, so again, this is kind of cool because you can see this shows you the cycle of follicle maturation. So we start off with these primordial follicles, and again, the primordial follicles will develop, especially once follicle-stimulating hormone is released, and they'll produce more follicle cells. They'll start to produce this fluid-filled cavity, and you can see eventually will develop into our secondary follicle. And that secondary follicle will, again, continue to develop. So the follicle cells are continuing to divide, and this area is getting larger. And then also, this fluid-filled cavity is also getting larger. And so then, eventually, this fluid-filled cavity will form an antrum and push this now secondary oocyte over to one side. And then you can see here we have this right around the oocyte. We have the zona pellucida and the corona radiata here. And that's going to stay with the zona pellucida, and the corona radiata will be the only parts that will actually stay with the oocyte from this follicle. So then upon ovulation, what's going to happen here is the follicle will then release the oocyte, and the oocyte again will keep the zona pellucida and then the corona radiata right around it, again as a kind of barrier to help protect the cell, and it also plays a role in terms of fertilization. So that's very important that, again, we're not maintaining all of the follicle cells. Most of the follicle cells are actually left behind. And as you're going to see, these follicle cells will actually form eventually what's called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum will secrete hormones like estrogen and progesterone, which are very important to the cycle. So that gives you kind of a little insight. We'll go over the step-by-step process for this in a minute, but it gives you a little insight into what's going to be happening in the ovarian and uterine cycle. So ovulation. Ovulation is the process, the name that we give for the process where we're actually releasing that secondary oocyte. So literally, it sounds kind of brutal, but literally that follicle is going to burst and release that secondary oocyte. And the oocyte, as we talked about, is surrounded by layers of follicular cells, mainly the zona pellucida and the corona radiata. If the oocyte is not fertilized shortly after its release, it will degenerate. Okay? And so again, that's important as well because we're going to talk about then the lead into the cycle for menstruation there. Release of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary is what's going to trigger ovulation. And we're going to talk about this coming up here in just a minute. But it's important to remember again, we talked about the roles of luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulating hormone in males. So now we're going to talk about, again, its function in females. And the terms are actually going to make much more sense because they're named after what their main function in females. So upon ovulation, you'll see that we have a spike, and that's actually one of the ways that you can test to see if ovulation is occurring is you can test for luteinizing hormone. And the luteinizing hormone will spike just before ovulation. So and just as a reminder, that's what LH is. LH is luteinizing hormone, and FSH is your follicle stimulating. I'm just going to abbreviate stimulating there. Stimulating hormone. That's my abbreviation for stimulating. So that's FSH. So again, just as a reminder that when I use those abbreviations, that's what I'm referring to. So again, it's important, hint, hint, that you know that spike of luteinizing hormone is going to trigger ovulation. And this, what will happen is when that luteinizing hormone is released, this is going to cause that mature follicle to rapidly swell, and that starts to weaken its walls to a point until finally it just bursts open, and that secondary oocyte literally oozes out of the ovary's surface. So now we're going to talk about the accessory organs to the female anatomy, and of course the uterine tubes would be kind of the next step in terms of when we talk about ovulation. That oocyte, when you undergo ovulation, that oocyte is going to be released into the uterine tubes. And so again, we have a pair of uterine tubes, and then that uterine tubes will connect to the uterus, and of course the uterus connects to the vagina via the cervix. Okay, so this is a nice diagram of everything all together. So here you can see, here are the ovaries, and this is kind of cool because they drew an ovary out showing you the different stages of follicular development there. And again, upon ovulation, they showing an oocyte here that was released, and the oocyte would then be accepted into the uterine tubes because these little fimbriae, little finger-like structures, are going to sweep back and forth, kind of sucking the egg into the uterine tubes. And then the oocyte will travel down the uterine tube to the uterus. And so here is the uterus, and you can see it's this very thick muscular structure here. And if you look at the uterus is going to have an inner lining called the endometrium, which again is the lining that would be shed during menstruation. And then here's the myometrium just below it, which is the muscular portion of that. Very important, right, for labor and childbirth. And then you have, of course, the outer edge here, the perimetrium. This is the outer kind of connective tissue layer here. And then at the very base of the uterus here, leading into the vagina, is the cervix. Okay, so the cervix is basically the opening into the uterus. And then, of course, you have the vagina below that. And you can see that there's a layer of mesentery that helps to hold the ovaries in place. Now, in terms of some of your external anatomy, external female anatomy, you have, and this is more probably to help you out with lab than anything else, but you've got the clitoris, which is going to be the erectile tissue here. You have the labia minora, and then the labia majora out here, and of course this is the vaginal opening, and then this is the urethra, opening of the urethra. For the release of urine, and they drew in the anus here because this area that includes the vagina and the anus, this whole area is oftentimes referred to as the perineum. So again, if you hear someone talking about the perineal region, this is the region that they're talking about. Okay, so now let's get into the nitty-gritties in terms of how ovulation occurs, menstruation occurs, and how hormones play a part in this. So hormones, again, are going to be secreted by the hypothalamus, as they were secreted, again, in the males as well, and the anterior pituitary, and then the ovaries. So again, the big difference here being that you're secreting, again, some hormones from ovaries now, and not from testes. And so the hormones that are going to be secreted from, again, these three areas are going to help control female reproduction and the development of your secondary sex characteristics. We're going to talk about how that happens here. So, at about age 10, the hypothalamus is going to start to secrete the gonadotropin-releasing hormone. Remember that? It's the same hormone that we saw again when we talked about the male reproductive anatomy. And that gonadotropin-releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus travels through the blood to the anterior pituitary, where just like it did in men, okay, it's going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release, you guessed it, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, so now as you're going to see, the release of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone will eventually, and we'll talk about how this happens, cause the release of estrogen. Okay, and so then you can see that there's a nice negative feedback cycle here, just as we saw in men, to help ensure that we don't release too much hormone, too much luteinizing hormone, and too much follicle stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. So we do have a nice negative feedback mechanism, just like we did in the males, to ensure that we are secreting just the right amount of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, now at puberty, the ovaries are going to be synthesizing estrogen in response, finally, to the follicle stimulating hormone. So remember, it's at puberty that females will start to release this follicle stimulating hormone, and that follicle stimulating hormone will stimulate the ovaries to start producing estrogens. Now, as you probably know, estrogens are obviously responsible for female secondary sex characteristics, right? Such as breast development, increased adipose tissue deposition. You may say, well, why do we have the increased adipose tissue deposition? And this is in preparation for childbirth. So again, as a female undergoes puberty, and her eggs again are going to be developing to a point that they can be fertilized, then the female body will help to prepare for the burden of bearing a child by producing this excess adipose tissue. And then increased vascularization of the skin, again, in preparation for childbearing as well. Or for child, I should say, for pregnancy, really. The ovaries also are going to secrete progesterone. Okay, so estrogen and progesterone are going to be the two main hormones, that female sex hormones, that are going to be released from the ovaries. And progesterone is important because it helps to trigger the uterine changes that occur during the menstrual cycle. And we'll talk about these here in just a minute. So the menstrual cycle is typically characterized by these monthly changes that we're going to see in the uterine lining, as the uterine lining gets thicker and thicker and more vascular, and then eventually is shed. And that will eventually, obviously, when that uterine lining is shed, lead to your menstrual flow as that inner lining. And remember, it's the endometrium that's shed. It's that inner lining of the uterus that's shed. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the ovarian cycle, the major events that occur in both the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle, and then I'll show you the verbiage slides that I have. So these slides here are for you mainly for study purposes. I'm going to go through this process on this slide here for you, and that way then, but just so you know, again, I'm basically going through these major events here. So I'm just doing it on this slide so you can see what's happening. So here, this is cool. This shows you the ovarian cycle, okay, and it overlaps it with the menstrual cycle. So the ovarian cycle is talking about the major events that are occurring in the ovaries. And here in the uterine cycle, this is talking about the major events that are occurring in the uterus and what's happening with that endometrium lining of the uterus. So here you can see again, this will start at menstruation here, okay? And so again, menstruation is, you can see here, the uterine lining is shed, and this is here, this diagram here is showing you the thickness of the endometrium. So again, during menstruation, as you shed that endometrium, again, the endometrium lining becomes thinner and thinner. And so then, again, you'll see that some of the major events that kind of stimulate the cycle is that the anterior pituitary is going to secrete follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, follicle stimulating hormone, okay, is going to go down, and follicle stimulating hormone will actually travel through the bloodstream again and make its way to the ovary, and it's going to stimulate follicle maturation. So it's going to stimulate these primordial follicles to develop into primary, secondary, and then mature follicles. Okay, so it'll encourage again those follicle cells to undergo cell division so they produce more of them, and then it'll also encourage the production of this fluid-filled cavity that will eventually become the antrum. The follicular cells will start to produce and then secrete estrogen. So it's actually these follicular cells that will produce and secrete the estrogen. And that estrogen will start to cause, and so here you can see, that's where they draw the estrogen here. So as estrogen is released from the follicle, the estrogen will start to cause the endometrium to thicken here and become very vascular. So, okay, again, you can see we're talking about some of these events that are happening that are overlapping between the ovaries and the uterus. So then, right around ovulation, okay, all of a sudden you're going to see there is a huge spike, okay, especially just before ovulation, of luteinizing hormone. And again, it's that luteinizing hormone that stimulates ovulation here. So the luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate again the swelling of this follicle to the point where eventually then the oocyte is released because the follicle just bursts. And so then and this is where luteinizing hormone is going to get its name. These follicular cells that are left behind here, so here's the oocyte that was released. Here, these follicular cells that are left behind here now are going to develop into the corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum, these cells start to become very secretory, meaning they're preparing to secrete substances as they change again from these follicle cells into the corpus luteum. And so as those follicular cells become the corpus luteum, they're going to start to secrete estrogens and progesterone. So again, this corpus luteum now will secrete estrogen and progesterone, which is what you see here. Okay. So estrogen is going to continue to stimulate the uterine wall to develop. So again, as it releases estrogen, estrogen is going to continue to stimulate this uterine wall to get thicker. Progesterone will actually stimulate the endometrium to become more glandular and vascular. And so progesterone is going to literally again, increase the blood vessels that are moving through this endometrium and increase secretions by increasing the glandular tissue here. And then both estrogens and progesterones that are released will actually go back through a negative feedback cycle and inhibit the secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So again, estrogen and progesterone will inhibit the release of these, so that way then we're not releasing too much luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. Then, okay, so now we still have that oocyte, okay, that's been accepted from ovulation, this oocyte that was then accepted into the uterine tubes. Now, if that secondary oocyte is not fertilized, what will happen is the corpus luteum will start to degenerate, okay? And so here the corpus luteum is starting to degenerate, and eventually we will be left with this little bit of kind of scarred tissue called the corpus albicans at the end of it. But as that corpus luteum degenerates, then your estrogen and progesterone levels are going to go down, right? Because that was what was secreting estrogen and progesterone. And so as those estrogen and progesterone levels go down, the blood vessels in the endometrium here will start to constrict. And so then as those blood vessels constrict, that uterine lining will start to disintegrate here and slough off, and that's what produces your menstrual flow. Okay. Now, the anterior pituitary gland will no longer be inhibited once progesterone and estrogen are no longer secreted, okay, over here. And so then luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone will again be released, and the whole cycle will repeat itself again. Okay. So again, this is how the cycle kind of continues to repeat itself. So again, luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormones start the whole process. And then, again, towards the end of the ovarian cycle, the corpus luteum secretes the estrogen and progesterone, which inhibit the release of these two. And then, eventually, as that corpus luteum breaks down and progesterone and estrogen are no longer being produced, then they can no longer inhibit the luteinizing hormone and the follicle-stimulating hormone, and the whole cycle starts again. So again, this just is spelling out, I just again put this step-by-step slide for you in here, and this is part of the slides that I added to this lecture just to make it a little bit easier for you in terms of your studying. So again, these are the major events that happen in the reproductive cycle of a female. Again, the anterior pituitary is going to secrete that follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. The follicle-stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the follicles to mature, and the follicular cells will start to produce and secrete estrogen. Estrogen will start the endometrium to thicken, okay, so it start thickening that endometrium. Then the anterior pituitary is going to release a surge of luteinizing hormone that's going to stimulate ovulation. So then the oocytes released into the uterine tubes, and then the follicular cells that are left behind in the ovary end up becoming the corpus luteum, and they're going to secrete estrogens and progesterone. Estrogen, again, will continue to stimulate that uterine wall to get thicker, and progesterone is going to stimulate the uterine wall, the endometrium, to become more glandular and vascular. Okay? And both estrogen and progesterone will inhibit, again, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Then if the secondary oocyte, again, isn't fertilized, and I should talk about if the secondary oocyte is fertilized, okay, just so you know, then the corpus luteum will remain intact, and the corpus luteum will continue to secrete estrogens and progesterones, which will prevent the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone and prevent ovulation. Okay, so again, remember, if we're inhibiting luteinizing hormone, then we would be inhibiting ovulation. So again, we talked about if the secondary oocyte isn't fertilized, the corpus luteum degenerates. But if it is fertilized, the corpus luteum then will stay intact and continue to secrete estrogen and progesterone and inhibit the secretion of these two hormones and thereby inhibit ovulation. But if that secondary oocyte's not fertilized, then the corpus luteum degenerates, and as estrogen and progesterone concentrations decrease, blood vessels in the endometrium constrict, and boom, the uterine lining is shed. Okay? Then follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are no longer inhibited, and so then we can start secreting these two hormones again, and it starts the process all over again. So a menstrual cycle obviously is going to continue throughout a woman's life until she hits menopause. And again, it's sometime around middle age. And this is when the cycle ceases. The cause of menopause is usually the aging of the follicles. So the aging of the ovarian follicles. And when those follicles no longer mature and estrogen levels decline, that's when menopause technically starts. Okay, so some other accessory female reproductive organs are going to be, of course, the mammary glands. And the mammary glands, of course, are specialized to produce and secrete milk after pregnancy. So again, for lab purposes, you can see here you have all of these alveolar glands. That's where the milk will be produced. And then they will eventually dump into these, the milk into these alveolar ducts. And then the alveolar ducts will all dump into these lactiferous ducts. And then the milk will be released. Now, this would be kind of interesting. So since we've talked about the cycle, now we can talk about a couple different methods of birth control. And obviously, birth control refers to, again, voluntarily regulating the number of offspring that would be produced. And this, of course, requires contraception, probably nothing new to you guys as adults. So this is just going to list out some of the different methods for reproduction, or for for birth control, not reproduction, right? The opposite of reproduction. So the first one is coitus interruptus, just like it sounds, okay? This would be withdrawing the penis before ejaculation. Not obviously the safest method for birth control. There's also the rhythm method, which is monitoring temperature. Again, body temperature will rise just around ovulation. And then you can also monitor the mucous membranes of the vagina, and typically again as right around ovulation, that mucus will become very kind of a thick consistency, almost like an egg white, right around ovulation. So again, you know, this is tough because you really have to be paying attention to things, but if you are one to really pay attention to your body and you notice again that you're starting to see that change in the vaginal mucus, then that's again a good indicator that ovulation is occurring. And it typically, the description for this is that it typically becomes more like the consistency of an egg white. Then, of course, there's mechanical barriers. So again, you know, female and male condoms here, right? Female and male condoms form a nice mechanical barrier. And then there's also chemical barriers as well. So you have, you know, your spermicide creams, your foams, and your spermicide jellies. And then, and obviously, using these two together is most effective using, again, a mechanical barrier along with a chemical barrier. Although you have to be careful because some condoms, again, you can, depending upon, you know, some of the spermicidal creams, what spermicidal cream you're using, some of them can weaken your actual mechanical barrier condom, so you have to pay attention to that as well. Again, probably nothing new for you guys, but you know, I'm covering it all here. So oral contraceptives obviously are going to work in a manner that they're going to kind of trick the body into thinking that it's pregnant. So by delivering estrogen and progesterone, and so by delivering, and this is kind of interesting because now you guys know how this works, by delivering estrogen and progesterone. Okay, and remember, estrogen and progesterone will inhibit the secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and so that thereby inhibits ovulation because we don't get that spike in luteinizing hormone that stimulates ovulation. Then there are injectable contraceptives like your Depo-Provera. So again, this is just injecting instead of taking an oral, injecting these contraceptives. There's also, and in the just so you know, the injectable contraceptives are an intramuscular injection of a synthetic kind of version of progesterone. And again, this helps to protect, obviously, against pregnancy for a longer period of time than just your oral contraceptives. You, again, get one injection and it's supposed to protect against pregnancy for up to 3 months. And it does this by preventing the maturation and the release of your secondary oocyte. A little more than you need to know, but some of you might be interested. Contraceptive implants is obviously another method. So things like your IUDs that will release progestin. Then you have your intrauterine devices. Again, your IUDs that will actually alter. And so not all IUDs will release contraceptives. So again, some IUDs will release contraceptives like progestin, which is a synthetic progesterone. But then you can have just the intrauterine device by itself without releasing any contraceptives, actually alters the lining of the uterus, possibly kind of by basically inflaming the uterine tissues just by the presence of it there. So that makes the uterus less willing to accept an oocyte. And then, of course, there are surgical methods. So again, the surgical methods are on the female end of it, obviously tubal ligation. So again, this would be where the uterine tubes are cut and ligated. And then, of course, on the male end of this, it would be a vasectomy, where we are actually going in and ligating the vas deferens right near the epididymis. Okay, so this last bit is just the opposite of contraception, or maybe it's when contraception fails, right, which could happen. And so that could lead to pregnancy. And so obviously pregnancy involves the fertilization of an oocyte. And what will happen is the sperm will bind to the zona pellucida. And remember, again, it's got that acrosome sac around it, and that acrosome sac will burst and start to break down some of that outer layer of the zona pellucida. So again, that's what we mean here when we say undergoes the acrosomal reaction. Again, the acrosome will release its bag of digestive enzymes and digest away some of that zona pellucida, so that, again, then the DNA from inside the sperm cell can then be released into the oocyte. So then, when we have fusion of the oocyte and the sperm plasma membranes, this is fertilization here. And then we have what's called the cortical reaction that will happen just shortly after fusion here. And that's where there are enzymes that will be released that will prevent any other sperm from binding to the egg. So again, the egg will produce these enzymes that will prevent another sperm from binding to that egg. And obviously, again, fertilization is when the chromosomes of the male and the female gametes join. Okay, so again, this will happen after, again, the fusion of the oocyte and sperm plasma membrane occurs. Then the chromosomes, again, will join, and now you have what we call a zygote. Once we get the chromosomes of the male and female gametes joining, now we have a zygote. Now we have a cell with a full set of genetic information. So again, this is just showing these sperm cells trying to get through this, again, this outer layer of the corona radiata and then the zona pellucida. And so again, we have to have what's called the acrosomal reaction here, and that's what you see again, the acrosome, the acrosomal sac bursts and releases the digestive enzymes that will digest away this zona pellucida. And then you have the fusion of the oocyte and the sperm plasma membranes. And then again, we have the cortical reaction, which are going to be changes that occur here in the oocyte that will prevent another sperm from fertilizing this egg. And then, again, the sperm nucleus here literally is going to be engulfed by the oocyte cytoplasm, so that way then the DNA can then fuse with the DNA of the oocyte. So this is just going to kind of go over the stages of early development. This is just kind of more for interest. I'm not necessarily going to test you on, because we just don't have time to get into the different stages of human development, but kind of interesting. You can see, I do want you to know that fertilization needs to occur. This is probably the one really important bit of information that I want you to know, is that fertilization can occur at about 12 to 24 hours after ovulation. Okay? So again, after ovulation, fertilization needs to occur, again, pretty rapidly. And this is why it makes it very challenging in terms of, you know, if you are a female trying to get pregnant, by the time that you know that you're ovulating, again, you have a very short period of time to get those sperm into the reproductive tract, because the sperm have to travel all the way, as you're going to see from the Great Sperm Race, all the way up the vagina, through the uterus, and into the uterine tubes, and this is a long journey for the sperm. So again, you know, oftentimes sex can occur just before ovulation, and those sperm are just making their way into the uterine tubes at the right time. So again, this is just showing you the sperm nucleus and the egg nucleus getting ready to fuse here. And when they fuse, then we have what's called a zygote. And so again, remember that fusion or fertilization, okay, fertilization here takes place in the uterine tubes, okay? So not in the uterus, but in the uterine tubes. So then, once we have, again, the fusion of the genetic material from the sperm cell and the egg cell, we have a zygote. And shortly after the formation of that zygote, that cell will undergo then its very first mitotic division. So it's going to undergo mitosis. Okay? So then, day one, you now have, you got the two-cell stage. Okay, so meaning that that egg now consists of two cells. Then at day two, each of those cells will divide, and you're at the 4-cell stage. By day 3, again, you've had more cell divisions, and you start to form this ball of cells that we call the morula. And here you can see by day 4, that ball of cells has gotten even bigger. So we continue to undergo cell division after cell division. And so again, the first cleavage is kind of interesting. The first cleavage or first completion of cell division is completed about 30 hours after fertilization. Okay, and then here you can see as that zygote develops, then at day 6 or 7 after fertilization, this cell will basically be this big hollow sphere of cells called a blastocyst. And that blastocyst will actually implant into the uterine lining. So again, I'm not going to test you on all of this. I will test you on this, but I'm not going to test you on all of this, but it's just interesting information in terms of how development occurs. So here you can see this is implantation, and when that blastocyst implants in the uterine lining, it will cause changes to occur in the uterine lining, and you'll see an increase in blood vessels forming here, and this is going to eventually form the placenta. So hormonal changes that are going to occur during pregnancy, I do want you to know this. The outer layer of cells of that blastocyst stage are going to secrete a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, and that's HCG. And that's actually what your pregnancy tests are testing for. They're testing for levels of HCG. And that HCG is what's secreted that is going to maintain the corpus luteum. So remember that, again, if the egg isn't fertilized, the corpus luteum degenerates. Well, what prevents the corpus luteum from degenerating is the release of this human chorionic gonadotropin. Okay? And again, it's actually the zygote that's releasing, or now we're calling it a blastocyst at this stage, that's actually releasing the HCG. And so that HCG will then maintain the corpus luteum, and that corpus luteum then will continue to secrete progesterone and estrogen, and that will prevent menstruation and also prevent ovulation by continuing to secrete that progesterone and that estrogen. So this helps maintain the uterine lining and maintains pregnancy. Levels of HCG will remain high until the placenta can produce enough hormones on its own. Eventually, the placenta will be able to produce those hormones on its own to maintain the pregnancy. So, and again, pregnancy tests, those home pregnancy tests are actually testing for levels of HCG. So here you can see the formation of the placenta, both embryonic and maternal tissue. So both, again, baby tissues and mom's tissues are going to contribute to the formation of the placenta. So a little bit of anatomy on the placenta. Exchanges are going to occur across what are called the chorionic villi between the maternal and fetal blood. So again, here you can see these are the chorionic villi, and this is where exchanges are going to occur between, again, fetus and between mom. So this is how mom is going to share nutrients and oxygen with the fetus. So again, that's what they're saying here again, that it's through these chorionic villi that the mom is going to provide the fetus with nutrients and, of course, with that important gas, oxygen. It's also where the fetus will exchange nutrients back with mom to get rid of waste products. So the fetus will dispose of its waste that way. This also allows hormonal signals to be sent to mom from the fetus. And by week 13, the placenta will be fully formed. And then, of course, we can't talk about pregnancy without talking about parturition. Parturition is going to be the formal name for childbirth. And it typically is on average about 266 days, right? Around 9 months, okay? Or 266 days after fertilization. Labor is a term that we use for the process by which and events that occur that actually expel the infant, obviously, from the uterus. So, and again, we're not going to go into, although it's interesting, we're not going to go into the stages of childbirth and labor just because it's a little bit too much detail for this class. So that concludes our anatomy lecture, and this is the very last lecture of the semester. So you've made it through. Congratulations. I also want to remind you that you will receive extra credit if you watch all of the Great Sperm Race. I think it is a really great video to help you in terms of visually understanding what's happening in both male and female reproductive anatomy, and you get extra credit for it, right? Just for doing a write-up on it. And you can submit that write-up to me either via email or, and if you email it to me, please email it through Canvas so I can keep track of it and we have a record of it. And then, or you could just turn it into me on the last night of the exam. So if you have any questions, please feel free again to write into me on the discussion board, or you can send me an email. And other than that, I will see you all the night of the exam.